Welcome to Unity Books Presents. I'm Ellen Debenport. I'm the Vice President of Publishing at Unity, and I got to be the editor on tonight's book, Unity and World Religions. So we'll be talking with the author, Paul John Roach, and his guests will be joining us in a few minutes, Philip Goldberg and Vanessa Sasson. They are all knowledgeable about world religions, and it seems a good time in history, doesn't it, to remember and be more aware of all that we have in common, even with people from different backgrounds. Unity and World Religions is selling fast. Amazon has run out of books twice now. They will get more. It is on Kindle, and it is on the Unity website. You can find Unity and World Religions at unity.org/worldreligions. We'll be taking your questions later. If you have questions as you're listening, put them in the chat box, send the message to everyone, not a particular person, and use chat and not Q&A. So, Unity and World Religions. There are two ways to think about the title of this book. We'll be talking about both. One is the unity of the world's religions, how the same teachings or universal principles have been taught in all religions for thousands of years. There is also a spiritual movement called Unity. It started in the United States in the late 1800s. Paul and I are both Unity ministers. So we'll also talk about how these universal principles from world religions show up as the basic teachings of Unity today. I have a few questions for Paul, and then we'll bring on our guests. So let me introduce you to him. Paul John Roach is a native of Wales, which you will know the minute you hear him speak. He has degrees from Oxford and the University of Wales. He's been a Unity minister since 1988, and his entire church career was at Unity of Fort Worth, Texas, 30 years. He's also for many years been the host of a live radio show called World Spirituality. So every week he has met and interviewed lots of people from lots of different faiths. Those podcasts are available at unityonlineradio.org. So Paul, let's start with the general understanding that these same spiritual principles run like a golden thread through all the world's religions. They are ancient, they've been handed down for thousands of years. Sometimes they're called the perennial philosophy, and they're also the foundation of our unity teachings. We call them the 5 principles, but we'll get to that. What are they in general? How would you describe the perennial philosophy as it's understood around the world?
Hello, Ellen. Thanks to everybody for tuning in to this panel discussion tonight. I'm really honored to have you with us. In all the many years of my study of and practice of world religions, what's excited me the most is that there is this commonality between each religion at core. If you're only on the surface, you might not see it, but once you go into depth in each tradition, you'll notice these commonalities. And yes, they're often called the perennial philosophy. Aldous Huxley wrote that beautiful, let's see, am I going off and in and out here on my screen? I'm trying to avoid that. Let's see.
You're okay.
Whoops. Am I okay? Because from my end, I'm kind of disappearing.
I think if you'll sit still, it'll be okay.
All right. Okay. Here we go. Yeah, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy, and when I read it, I was fascinated by it because it corroborated everything that I believed, that there is this golden thread. That's the phrase I like to use, a golden thread, because, yes, there's a diversity of understanding and ideas and practices, but within that diversity is this golden thread of commonality, which is really the unitive idea, this idea of oneness, this idea that we are divine beings, the idea that everything works out for good because the consciousness is paramount. And really it ties in with these 5 principles, these great principles actually that we have in Unity that are universal principles of truth. And we're going to talk about that in our panel discussion. But the book has 4 reasons for being, I think. The first is an overview of religions. So if you're interested in finding out more about religions in a user-friendly way, then the book is going to be helpful. It's also a little bit of my personal journey and my personal story in terms of how I unfolded and understood the truth principles. And then, of course, there is the tying in of the five unity principles to world religions. So that's a common thread through the book. And the other thing was I wanted it to be readable, accessible, and I think it is. But from the comments that I've been getting from people, it's a good read, but it's also a reference book. So if you want to read it and have fun with it, but then you can come back to it later and find out a little bit more about each tradition. There's a big bibliography, a big index, and a study guide. So there's plenty of ways to approach the book. So it tries to cover everything really in a way, in a very succinct format.
It's very succinct and very readable. And I had the same thought. You can read it cover to cover, but I think people will also go back to it. I kept thinking about ministers on a Saturday night when they need a quote from somebody who's Buddhist. They can go open the book.
Yeah. And I did put a lot of quotes in there. I talk a lot about spiritual teachers and masters. So there's something that's valuable, that you could just find an amazing quote and use it as an aid to contemplation or meditation too. So the book has that ability as well. So it's not just a read in your head. It opens up your heart as well. There's a lot of transformative teachings within the book. And that's what I love about world spirituality and the truth of religions, is that they're inspirational, they're transformative, they changed my life, and I'm excited about it. And I wanted the book to have that same kind of excitement.
How did the golden thread work its way all the way down to unity? Because unity is only about 130 years old.
Well, unity has always been a very eclectic movement, right? Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, the founders, they were traditional Christians, Presbyterian and Methodist, but they wanted more. They wanted a deeper understanding. And so they looked in many different places, mental healing, transcendentalism, Hinduism, Buddhism, the occult, Christianity, of course. They wanted a deeper understanding of that. So they looked in all directions and they found this universal teaching, that's with what we're talking about, that's common to everyone. And they were able to put it together in a very succinct way. It was Christ-based, it was Bible-based, but it was not limited to the Bible or to Christ, because it understood that the Christ was a name for the divinity within all of us that could be called by various names, Great Spirit or the Buddha nature, whatever. But they understood that essential unity. And of course, it's a genius thing, isn't it? That unity is called unity. It came to Charles in meditation one day. And I think it's just the perfect name for our movement, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the unity of understanding. We are one with the divine, and we are of the divine. We have the essence of the divine within us. We are one. And we're one with every single person and sentient being on this planet. So it's a great name for the movement, because it's so succinct. It really sums up what we're about.
So are you going to talk about what the principles are with Phil and Vanessa, or should we do that?
Yeah, we'll talk. We'll unpack them a little bit. If you want to mention the 5 principles, that'd be fine.
Well, I'll let you unpack them. Let's go ahead and bring in Phil Goldberg and Vanessa Sasson. Welcome to both of you. So let me tell our listeners, both of these people have books you'll want to read. Phil Goldberg is an author, speaker, teacher. He's an ordained interfaith minister. I am pleased to say he writes for Unity Magazine. And you might want to start with his book, American Veda, if you haven't read it. It is about the influence of India on Western spirituality over the past century. We didn't always know words like mantra or guru or ashram. Meditation has not always been routine in America. American Veda explains how all of this came about, how heavily influenced we have been by India, especially those of us who call ourselves spiritual but not religious. Then Vanessa Sasson is a religious studies professor at Marianopolis College in Quebec. She took her academic research and wrote some academic books, but she also wrote a novel about the wife of the Buddha. You remember his story. He left behind a wife and child when he went off to seek enlightenment. Well, what about her? Who was she? How did she feel about all of this? So the title is Yasodhara, and I'm sorry, Yasodhara. Is that how you pronounce it, Vanessa?
It's okay. Yashodhara.
Yashodhara and the Buddha. It's a fascinating story about who they were and what might have happened. So you all have a lot to talk about. I'm going to turn this discussion over to Paul. I will come back later with your questions. So in case you came in late, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. Send the message to everyone, not a particular panelist, and use chat, not Q&A. So I will be watching, and then I will come back with your questions later. So Paul, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. You know, I've known Phil for many years, and you know, I went to India myself in my early 20s and spent some time there, about a year there. And so when I read American Veda, it was brilliant for me, because a lot of it I knew already, because I had an in-depth knowledge, but there was so much in it that I didn't know. And what a great book it is. So it's a life-changing book. You know, there's two great books that have been written about Eastern religions. Rick Fields wrote When the Swans Come to the Lake, about Buddhism in America. And Phil's written the other book about Hinduism in America. So these are two classics. Great guy. He's been on my show several times. And Vanessa's been on my show because I found out about the wonderful book that she'd written. And I was delighted to read it, and even more delighted to discuss it with her. So I thought it'd be wonderful to have her on the show today on the panel discussion. So one thing that I think is important to state in terms of, you know, because we see unity in everything, doesn't mean we're trying to make all religions one. It's not a syncretic approach, as we might say, where you know, we're getting rid of all the diversity. In fact, it's the opposite, right? We're celebrating diversity, and both of you have knowledge of you know, Buddhism, Hinduism, and they can't get more diverse than those two religions, and yet they have a solid core, don't they? They have a solid understanding. So Phil, your book is full of the distinctions between the various sects, right, in Hinduism.
Yes. At first, I want to thank Ellen and you for mentioning it, and I want to offer a slight correction to what Ellen said. The book covers over 2 centuries of the history, so it includes the origins of unity and the other new thought movements and the influence of India. Right. On those early movements and then into the current era. Yes, I think you're making a very important point, and it shows up among scholars a lot. The perennialists have often been erroneously criticized for saying all religions are the same. Mm-hmm, right. And it's kind of an insult to any smart person who studies the world's religions, like Houston Smith did and Aldous Huxley did, because they're obviously different. But at their depths, when you get away from dogma and doctrine and truth claims and views of history and that sort of thing, when you come deep into the realm of core principles and, most important, the experience of unity with the divine, and the practices that bring people into those depths of spiritual awareness, that's where you find the unity. And that's what Huxley's book emphasized.
Yes, thank you. You know, Vanessa, one of the things I love about Buddhists in general, and I'm sure it's not true of all Buddhists, you can't generalize too much, but is the lightheartedness, right? The buoyancy of the teaching. They're not taking life too seriously, even though classically we talk about Buddhism as the religion of suffering, how to overcome suffering. It seems there's a lot of joy in Buddhism too, and I think because of that joy and that buoyancy, the lightheartedness, it avoids sectarianism. It avoids the idea that I'm right and you're wrong. There's an embrace, right? There's a welcome of all kinds of folks in that Buddhist tradition.
I think in the best of times, that's true. In the worst of times, it's not true.
Yeah, okay.
So it probably depends who we're talking to and when. But I do think the thing that you captured on the joy, I do think it's very pronounced and it's not often appreciated because Buddhism talks so much about suffering and it's so focused on becoming aware of your suffering and becoming aware of the suffering of the world. The word suffering comes up so much that there is a perceived actual heaviness to it. And yet the idea is that once you get past all of that, the joy is what you find at the end of it. And so you have to almost travel through the suffering and push it out of the way to find. So one of the scenes that I think about often with regards to that is there's a story when the Buddha achieves awakening under the tree. I'm sure many of the people in the audience have some imagination of a Buddha figure sitting under a tree, meditating. He achieves awakening or enlightenment as people talk about it. And then once he achieves enlightenment, he does something so odd. He thinks, oh, this was nice. And he decides, maybe I'll just stay here. And he has this moment where he thinks, I don't think I'm going to get up and teach because it's such a pleasure to enjoy what it is to see clearly. And so I think that's a little bit what you're talking about, of this kind of, maybe that's a bit of this golden thread of this joy and this pleasure of coming to terms, coming to an awake. I mean, in the Buddhist terms, we talk about seeing clearly, that when you get rid of all the muck and you see clearly, it's pleasurable. And it's something that you want to sit down and just enjoy. And he thinks to himself, maybe it's not worth it to teach because it'll be so troublesome, is actually what the texts say. It's going to be too tiring. People are going to argue with me. Everybody's going to get all divisive about everything, or they just won't understand what I'm trying to teach. And so maybe I should just stay here instead. And then finally he decides, okay, I'll get up and I'll teach. But there's that moment, that hesitation of the joy of being able to just sit with the experience. And I think that's a really special thing to heighten because we tend to think of all the heaviness of the tradition, but there is that joyfulness that's at the heart of it. And it's something that I see in your book a lot, is this kind of playfulness. It's what I was just telling you before we started. Your book has this wonderful play to it that you say it a few times in your book that we need to try it. And you included, I think you should talk to us a little bit about Dudism at one point.
Yeah, right.
Including that as this kind of playful approach and not taking ourselves so seriously, because we have to get all of that stuff out of the way, all of that heaviness where we take ourselves so seriously. So I thought that was something that you accomplished really beautifully in your book. Thank
you very much. It's a key element for me, in my ministry and also in my own spiritual practice. The idea that, not taking yourself too seriously, like you said, having that light touch and finding joy even in the midst of difficult circumstances. I mean, I'm thinking about Ukraine right now because it's on our minds, but I'm also thinking about the terrible suffering that's happening. But I'm also seeing the resilience and the dedication and the sheer courage that's there. And it seems to me they happen in the same circumstance, right? In the midst of the terror, in the midst of suffering, then there is this possibility for joy. It's a conundrum. It seems counterintuitive. And yet for me, it's very powerful because it's not like I have to escape from something. I'm simply seeing it differently. I'm choosing to see it in a more constructive, positive way. And of course, unity, in our tradition, we say life is consciousness, and wherever your mind is, that's what you're going to experience. So it is possible to shift your consciousness into a lighter, more buoyant place of possibility. So yeah, that's big for me. Yeah, Judaism is based on the book, the movie The Big Lebowski, of course, and was founded I don't know 10, 15 years ago by someone, and that now there's supposedly 470 thousand Dudist priests, and there's the Day of the Dude, I think March 6th, and you know, it's all based around the dude character in the Paper Bowski, who is sort of is laid back. He's a hippie. He's got Taoist tendencies. Just you know, take it easy, man. It's all okay. And for those of us that grew up in that era of the 60s and 70s, as I did, we can identify with some of those slacker type, hippie type dudes that represented by Jeff Bridges. And the interesting thing is that, you know, Jeff and Bernie Glassman, the Buddhist teacher, wrote a book together. You know, the Zen master meets the dude, and so gave us sort of a thumbs up to the idea of Buddhism. But yeah, what I like about it is, again, like you said, it doesn't take life too seriously, even in the midst of all the very difficult circumstances. And we're not trying to say we're in avoidance, right? Because we don't want to bypass suffering. The Buddha spent a great deal of time elucidating what exactly suffering is, but he did get to the fourth noble truth of the, you know, which is that there is a way beyond suffering.
I think the idea is that you have to know the suffering. So
yes.
You do have to go through the murkiness of that awareness of suffering and the consciousness of it and the heaviness of it. But the point, I think, and that's maybe that thread that you're alluding to here, is that there's something on the other side of it.
Right.
And is that, and then the question is are all religions kind of moving in the same direction to get us to the other side of some kind of murky experience?
That's one thing I wanted to do in the book was in each chapter, not just look at the 5 principles, but also look at the idea of suffering, because you know, many more books have been written about suffering, and then there's a term called theodicy. You know, we're trying to justify the ways of God to man, and why does God allow this suffering, this sadness in the world? And it's a conundrum. It's a difficult. I mean, the Book of Job, 42 chapters based around this. You know, why the heck is there such suffering? So yes, I think all religions do approach it. It's the core idea. You know, how do we get beyond the sadness of the human condition, and without being, you know, mired in it all the time and become a nihilist or whatever about it. Phil, in the tradition that you're, you know, familiar with in Hinduism, liberation is moksha, right? Is the idea of ultimate freedom. What's that mean for you?
Well, I think it's very similar to what you find in Buddhism. There's a state of consciousness that is inherent within us that I like to say we have a sanctuary of peace within us.
Yes.
That the true nature of what we are is one with the true nature of all that is in the universe. And some people call that the spirit of that God, and others have different names for it, but it is experienceable as our own true nature. And the permanent awareness of that is what the Eastern traditions have called enlightenment or liberation or awakening. The Buddha means the awakened one.
Right, exactly.
And so he was one of those people. Hindus call it jiva muktis, people who are awakened in the world, as opposed to, you know, post-life, post-human life. And that is a worthy aim to aspire to. And sometimes it seems totally out of reach because the role models for that we have for this seem to be exceptional human beings. But what the mystical teachings offer us, and I use that phrase because you'll find them in Judaism and Hinduism and Islam, as well as the Eastern traditions. What they offer us are methodologies and orientations so that there's a path to that ultimate state. And as I always like to tell people, you know, whether you reach that state or not is irrelevant. It's moving toward it that you have more and more of those qualities. So you may not have perfect joy and peace in the midst of chaos and suffering, but you'll have more of it.
Right.
You'll have a little more equanimity. You'll have a little more poise. You'll have a little more calm. You'll have a little more presence of mind as you evolve toward those states. And we're all evolving, and the traditions offer us methods for hastening and stabilizing that evolution.
Yeah, I just wrote an article for Unity magazine. I think it's out this month, and it's about the immediate path versus the gradual path. And I'm an immediate guy. I want it now, But as I studied this more and began to put this article together, I saw the validity of the gradual path, because even if you have moments of opening and awakening, then after the ecstasy, the laundry, you have to come back down to the earth, right, and live your life. So I got a renewed understanding of the value of the gradual path. By the way, I came across a great David Bowie statement the other day, and it said 25 famous statements of David Bowie. So I read them, and one of them was he said, "Really, there is no journey. Every moment is a beginning and an ending." And I thought, wow, that's wisdom. That's good. It's the present moment, right? We have this linear view that one day I'll be enlightened, but in truth, that enlightenment is here now. It's not a state that I will attain. It's a way of looking, isn't it? When I'm in a compassionate, expansive consciousness, then you could say I'm enlightened, for that moment, and then the next moment I might lose it again. But it's ever present, and I like that idea. I think it's in the Buddhist tradition that I forget the teacher, but I think he said one moment of recognition and I'm enlightened. One moment of delusion and I'm back in my old whatever negative state. But that's so true, isn't it? I think that's the goal, is to awaken to the moment, right? And that's something I found in all religions, is this great value placed on what's happening now. There are a lot of teachings about what happens after death, but the main teachings of each religion is how to live well now. And Jesus, of course, was famous as saying, let the dead bury the dead. We're about the living, and that'll take care of itself. If you live a good life, then that's what it's about. So let's move to
have a button in the 60s. The hippies, like people like me had a button saying, "Is there life after birth?"
Yeah,
that's very 1960s.
Yeah. Well, my late wife, my first wife, had a statement, was have no near life experiences, and I've always liked that one. Say near death experiences, but really most of us are near life. We haven't quite made it to full vibrant living, and so may that be a blessing for all of us. May you have a fully alive experience on this planet, whatever it is. Be fully alive to it. Let's talk about the 5 principles. I'll thumbnail them a little bit so we got an idea, and then we can dive in a little bit. The first one, of course, is essentially there's one presence and one power in the universe. The idea of the one, which you see in pretty much all religions. The second is if everything's one, then we as sentient beings, or we as human beings, are part of that one. And so we have the spark of divinity within us. The third is that everything seems to unfold according to a universal law. We call it the law of mind action in Unity, the law of Dharma. It has various names, but it seems to be a law of unfoldment. And then 4 is the perennial idea of prayer and meditation as ways to connect to the divine, or to understand the divine more fully within ourselves. And then 5thly, none of this is any good unless we're willing to act on it. And these are the 5 great universal principles that I've found, alive and well in every single tradition. And Vanessa, Buddhism is not a theistic system, right? There's certain elements of Buddhism, like Tibetan Buddhism, have kind of deities of some kind, but essentially there is no God. But maybe you don't need God, right? The presence, the ultimate power, whichever way you want to style it, is not necessarily a God out there, it's more of a presence that's everywhere, right? And I think the Buddhists maybe talk about sunyata, the idea of this spaciousness, this openness that's sometimes called emptiness. Talk about that. Is that similar to what some religions might call God?
It's a question I've wondered about for a long time. I think the jury's still out in my head about how to handle this kind of a question. There's all kinds of gods in Buddhism. Buddhism appropriated, basically you give them a god, they're happy to add it to their collection. It's a little bit like Hinduism in that way. It's just everyone's welcome and they can just take their spot in the temple. Right. But where Buddhism is striking, and so, you talked a lot in your book about not making them equal, right? Like recognizing the differences in traditions. Mm-hmm. One of the really big traditions is that Buddhism will have gods. It'll have lots of gods, as many as you want, but they're not the point. They're not important. And so it's not so much that Buddhism is atheistic or it's just not interested in theism. So the point is your awakening. So the gods are there. There's a very big imagined cosmos in Buddhism, and there's all kinds of creatures that Buddhists in different parts of the world might believe in. It doesn't really matter. What matters is one's ability to see clearly.
Yes.
What you're suggesting in terms of this idea of whether there's some kind of a spirit or energy or something that would connect to what you're saying, where I would see it is in somewhere else, and other people might disagree with me, but in one of the core ideas in Buddhism is this complicated term that I won't say in Sanskrit, but that basically means everything arises in dependence with everything else, that everything is connected. And this is actually a fundamental Buddhist idea, that it's the most basic thing, is that if this arises, that arises. And so it's as though independence doesn't exist. We all see each other because the other one's there. We're all connected on very fundamental, it's really hard to explain very quickly, but basically everything is connected and everything arises together. And I wonder if that's more the idea that would connect to this perennial philosophy that you're pulling out. I do think it's there in Buddhism. I wonder if it's more that than it is a god or not a god. I think the gods are irrelevant in Buddhism. The gods, they're part of the stage, but they're not the centerpiece.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of one of the creation hymns of the Rig Veda, which talks about God in potentiality was just the resting in the void, and then had the volition or the desire to see himself, to experience what it's like to be this thing, this emptiness that's just in the void. And from that volition arose the universe, and so they belong together. Once the universe was created, so to speak, then God was created, as a mirror image. And so it's a fascinating idea, but it points to something very profound for me, that each they nest in each other. So it's a bit what we could say in Hinduism, right? Shiva, Shakti, the male and the female, or the masculine and feminine aspects, yin yang, come together to create the universe. So it's the volition of God, or whatever it was. We don't need to call it God, perhaps. The volition of this initial impulse to see something created the world, and hence we want to see clearly too. The awakening is to that that wonder, and that's another thing I found, is that all religions have a lot of awe in them. The wonder. We haven't talked about Judaism much, but one of the things that Judaism is very keen to point out is the fear and trembling you have to have in relation to God. I don't think it means quivering on the ground as a miserable sinner, but just the idea of the magnificence. In the Bhagavad Gita, Phil, Arjuna was ready to see or he thought he was, right, ready to see the real form of God. and Krishna showed him a little bit, and he said, "Okay, that's enough.
That's
I
enough.
come back to human form, right? It's too awe-inspiring for me."
You mentioned the book of Job earlier,
Yeah.
and there's that section of the Bhagavad Gita and book of Job have a lot in common, because both those protagonists are questioning God,
Right.
and arguing with God, and they're both rewarded
Yes.
for that, essentially, with this incredible rare vision of the divine in all its splendor and beauty, and all the force of destruction and creation and everything that we think of as making up the created universe. And they have this vision of the divine manifestation in it. And it's a reward. And I've always taken that to mean that what really matters in the end is the persistence, because we'll be rewarded with some kind of experience. May not be as spectacular as Job or Arjuna. It may not be a full awakening of Buddha. It may not be the equivalent of the consciousness of Jesus, but it'll be some sense of connection to the divine. And that's what we have. And that's what you find in all the world's religions.
I mean,
Right.
the stories that you're just telling now makes me think of in Genesis, you have that amazing story where Jacob wrestles with this creature that appears, right? We've eventually decided it was an angel, but he's standing there alone in the dark on the edge of a river, and this being comes and wrestles. And the amazing thing about it, which reminds me of Krishna that you're describing it, and of Job, is that he fights him. Jacob doesn't say, "Oh, no, I'm not going to do that." Jacob fights with this character, and they fight until dawn. And at the end of that, he is rewarded with a new name, and it's a blessing, right? And so he spends this kind of magical night of the soul, if you want to go to St. John of the Cross, right? It's this kind of extraordinary existential struggle. And at the end of it, he's not reprimanded for having fought with an angel of God. He is said, you have prevailed. And so because of that, you get a new name, and that name is remembered for all eternity, right? It's this amazing gift. You fought, and for that, you are gifted. And I always thought that was an amazing story.
It is an amazing story. And in fact, he demands the blessing, if you remember the story.
That's right.
He won't let go of the angel until he's given that blessing. You know, that's the dedication, the resolute nature of it. And of course, in the process, though, his hip is out of shape, right? He's bent out of shape by the angel. So there's always a little wound. We carry our war wounds with us. I think that's what it's suggesting. But we get the blessing as well. So again, the both and, right? We're the walking wounded in a way. We're carrying some the cross, and yet the cross is light, right? That's what Jesus promised. You know, my burden is light. You know, my yoke is easy because I understand this higher way. But you can't get away scot-free. There's always going to be. We're always as long as we're in a human body, there's going to be some struggle, right? Yeah, very good.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please. Yeah, that's fine.
Well, I'm thinking of so many examples like this, but there's also that moment of Moses where he wants to see God, and then God does this odd thing, and he says, "No, you can't." And I feel so bad for Moses because he's always talking to God, and all of a sudden God says, "Well, if you want, you can stand on this rock, and you get to see me as I pass by from behind."
Yeah.
So Moses gets this kind of veiled experience of God, and I don't know why poor Moses gets that limitation, but you have this sense of his longing. He wants to be in the presence of God, and God has decided to limit it. And so there's that sadness of the longing in that story that's also quite beautiful.
There's a lot of interesting psychology in the Jewish tradition, right? The Talmud and later on in Kabbalah, in the Zohar, whatever. There's some funny stories, but it's again, based on the trickster aspect of God, which we see in other traditions as well. It's the idea, if you try and push it too hard, you push it further away. And sometimes that you know, that God points that out to you. You know, don't try so hard, and I'm not going to give you what you think you want. Interesting.
Paul, this reminds me, I think one of the values of
We're on a
your
roll
book-
now, by the way.
Yes,
We're
we
going
are.
to go on for hours.
Yes, done.
Picking up steam, picking up speed.
One
Yeah,
of the
so-
values of your book, and we must not forget, that's what we're here to promote.
Oh yeah.
Is I think people will learn about other traditions, and the value of that will be they can learn from those traditions.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was very important to me very early in my spiritual path, because I was raised with no religion or spirituality. And when I came to it, it was through the traditions of the East. But then when I read deeper and discovered perennialism, I discovered there's something called Christian mysticism. And there was John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila
Yes.
and
Yes.
Julian of Norwich. And I learned from them.
Yeah.
And I discovered there's something in Islam called Sufism. And I learned from them. And I learned from the Jewish mystics who I'd never heard about. And so there's much to be gleaned from this. It's not just a comparative religion study.
No.
That can be very superficial. This is looking at something to be gleaned from each of these traditions.
Yeah, and I'm
That is of worth.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I hope that my book does that a little bit. You know, that it's not just comparing. It's pointing always to this possibility of transformation that these traditions offer. Whether that's in the purely mystical state that you just referenced, or in terms of their practices. You know, because there's so many powerful practices. I'd known a lot of the mystical traditions for years. But in writing this book and studying more about Islam, I had a fair understanding of Sufism, but I filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge in terms of Islam. And I found it to be highly inspiring, actually, the dedication, the focus, the purposeful way that true Muslims approach their God and approach how to live a generous life is quite wonderful, actually, and I was quite impressed by it, and it, which was nice, because I think sometimes we think, oh, Islam, you know, they're all fanatics and they're all fundamentalists and etc. But really, their teaching is the opposite of that, and you know, it's unfortunate that it's some of the teachings have been co-opted by extremist groups. One of the teachers, one of the Sufis said, and he was killed for it, he says, I am God. And of course, to say that I am God in Islam, and that there's only one God, and that's Allah. But it slipped out of his mouth one day, you know, because he realized this union with the one, and they didn't like it. But is this true? We are God ultimately. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
Here's a question.
Yeah, that's a big one.
I'll let you handle it.
Answer a
Throw
question
it
like
out.
that.
Are you God?
I'm not taking that one.
Now, that's dangerous territory.
Yeah.
But I think even in the religions, in the traditions that emphasize oneness, and you know, the Upanishadic, what are called Mahavakyas, the great utterances.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is, "Thou art that. Thou art the yourself is the self of the universe."
Right.
You are Brahman. You are that.
Yeah.
But they don't say you are God, because there's also this notion of a creator God that's,
Right.
you know, different from you and me, but in essence, we are the same.
Right.
You're not that. You know, you are that, but God is God. So
Right,
it
yeah.
depends on how you look at these things.
Right. Somebody on the chat said, you know, I am an individualized expression of God. And that's we often use that phrase in unity. And I think that makes sense, you know, there is a distinction here, and it's dangerous, as you say, to think that, I am all that God is. There's the necessary awe and wonder of the magnificence of the transcendent God that's important. But it's essentially when Halaj, I think it was, made that statement, "I am God." I don't think he was in danger of forgetting the awesomeness of God. He was just so filled with the God flowing through him that he just exclaimed, without even thinking, it's, my goodness, I am one with the one. I am that. And in those moments, there's no separation, right?
And what he meant by I wasn't this person.
Right.
Yes, there we go. And we have the same problem with the I am statements in the Gospels, of course. Is Jesus referring to himself, or is he referring to the Christ's presence within him? And in unity, we would say he was referring to the presence which is in all people. So I am the way, the truth, and the life doesn't mean I have to come through Jesus. It means I come to it through an awareness of this awakening to the Christ in me. So totally different reading. All right, let's see. We talked a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just struck. So this is the kind of language that I obviously don't normally navigate.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, the I am God, or I am the manifestation, or the I of any of it. What you were just saying now, that tricky part of, or what Phil started with, it's not I, right? It's understood as something else, right? And that can go into ego territory really fast. And then all of a sudden we've got zealots and fundamentalists, and in 2 seconds we're at war. So I see all the danger of this kind of a conversation. And I have all my warning bells going off in my head. So I wonder, what if we turned it around, and instead of it saying, I am God, or I am a manifestation of God, or I am anything, what if it was to be other-centered, and it would be you? Wouldn't that change the conversation completely? If the responsibility would be to see, I see God in you, and in her, and in him, and in everywhere I look, I see it, instead of I see it in me. Because I find that me part really, really tricky in a world where fundamentalism is growing in every direction. There's no country, there's no religion left on earth that is not growing in fundamentalist leaps and bounds.
Yes.
So the I part really does concern me. And would it be more helpful to think about you are a manifestation of God instead of me?
Which is the idea of the Namaste, I guess, when we affirm that for someone. I behold the divinity in you. It's a very beautiful thing, isn't it? And I can't really do that unless somehow in me there is that same quality, but I'm not emphasizing it as my own special possession, right? I'm seeing it in you because I see it everywhere. It's in me and all around me. So yeah, I like that idea. And also it avoids a certain arrogance, that we could have, which leads to more fundamentalist approaches. And I mentioned in the book, fundamentalism is seen in certain religions, but it's alive and well in unity as well, where we have to have it a certain way. We spiritually bypass things, and just claim our good without really working out what exactly that is. So it can happen anywhere. Let's put it like that. Universality of prayer. I don't think there's one religion that doesn't emphasize prayer and meditation as a means to enter into an awareness of God. In unity we talk about affirmative prayer, aligning ourselves with the all, with the presence. But I had a rabbi on my show one time, and he says, that sounds fine, but we're okay with begging too in the Jewish tradition. So whatever prayer you have it can be effective if you have the right attitude of mind around it. So is it okay to beg? It's not my preferred way, but I guess it means whatever opens your heart, right, is valid.
I think sometimes begging is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you're so far away, or you're so lost, or you're so desperate. And I think sometimes that's when we pray the most.
Yeah. There we go.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So in other words, everything's relevant in the context of where you are at any given time, right? And chanting is very important in a lot of traditions, right? Islam, certainly, Catholic tradition, Hinduism, Buddhism. What does it do to chant the mantra or whatever? Why is it so effective, do you think?
It could be either one of us. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Whoever.
Well, there's something about raising one's voice in praise and thanksgiving. Someone just in the chat reminded us of Anne Lamott's famous saying that there are only three prayers: help, thanks, and wow.
Yeah, that's right.
And in chanting, you get a little of each.
Yeah.
You know, if you're feeling needy, part of the chanting is, you know, give me some, please. I need something.
Right.
I'm beseeching, but you're also singing in praise. You're in awe. You're in the wow of divinity.
Exactly.
And there's just the sheer vibratory quality of collective song, and you know, especially in the languages, the ancient languages, whether Hebrew or Sanskrit or any of the other or Arabic, where we're less likely, those of us in the English-speaking world, to attach ourselves to the meaning, and where the vibratory quality has value, as the early languages were structured.
You know, I mentioned that in my book. When I was a child and going to school, we had a religious assembly at the beginning of the day, and sometimes, because I grew up in Wales, they would do it in the prayers in Welsh, and I loved it because I didn't understand Welsh very well, but I loved the tone of it and the mysticism of it, and Lord Jesus Christ became yr arglwydd Iesu Grist. But there was something about the word arglwydd. It got me every time, and it means Lord. But it transported me, you know. And I think this is what you're talking about. I mean, though some Catholics want to go back to the Latin Mass because they prefer that to the English one, because there's a sense of the numinous there, you know. There's things going on that we don't always have to know about in our heads, right? That we can resonate with in our being, in our hearts, in our bodies. And I think chant that helps to do that as well. Have any thoughts on that, Vanessa?
Yeah, well, I would say two things. I would say, when I'm thinking of your Welsh background, my family's Middle Eastern, and I know that I can't understand Arabic, but when I hear Arabic sounds or I hear Arabic music, it's that vibratory thing that you're describing. There's something about it. It's like it's calling me home, and it makes me very emotional, and it does something to me that no other sound in the world can do, because it's home.
Yes.
And there's something about the familiar and of childhood and of sounds that are not about the intellect, and it's not about understanding, like you both said, what it means or what we're saying. It doesn't matter what we're saying. Sometimes it's literally just having an experience of a sound that just means something to us, and we don't even have to understand why it does. It's home. And if prayer becomes that home space, then it's something you carry with you all your life. It's not even something that you have to kind of artificially create. And I do think that's why there's also the fact that in every tradition we see not just this ecstatic prayer, which is wonderful when it happens, or a blissful prayer, but there's also the discipline of prayer or meditation, that you learn to practice it regularly so that it eventually becomes home, so that when you suddenly need it, it emerges out of you. And I think, so it's not always a great feeling. Sometimes you're just doing it, but you're thinking, am I almost done? Or, you know, like, did I turn off the stove? Or, oh my God, I can't believe I'm saying this again, right? Like there's a million things that go off in our minds, at least for me, when you can pray. But the idea is that then it's in your heart, that it will emerge when you need it, and not just, right? Because ecstatically won't always work. So I do think that the combination of the home and the discipline and the sounds, all of this kind of, and this is something I do think we see across the world. is that every culture in the world has this affinity and appreciation for these sounds that we want to summon, and that then we can use when we need them to connect with whatever it is we're looking for.
I love that idea. I can't remember who it was, but I think it was the gist of it was, you start by singing or chanting the prayer or the mantra or whatever, but then you end up with it singing and chanting you. It's within you, it's in your bones, and that's transformative. I see we're joined again by Alan. That means we're moving to the next stage of our discussion here. Is that correct, Alan?
It means we have got so many thoughtful questions from a pretty brilliant audience, seems
That's
to be.
awesome. Thanks again for tuning in, folks. This has been a wonderful experience, and really appreciate your insights. So let's talk about some of these wonderful ideas then.
Well, we have probably 15 more minutes, and we can talk about some of these questions. A lot of them are about Buddhism, but let me ask first, we almost specified this, but the question is, what are the commonalities of all religions? Do they all have the 5 principles, do you think? Or what is it that they have?
I personally believe they do, and I spent the whole book trying to convince everybody that they do, even though, like, for instance, some of them don't have God as such, like we mentioned earlier. There's still that sense of presence. And everybody wants to pray. That's crucially important. We didn't get to the 5th principle, which was action, but all religions emphasize, skillful action and compassionate action. The law is universal, and I think everybody has an idea that we are more than just our humanness, that there is some spark of divinity within us, something of God within us. So yes, I think there is that commonality in all religions. It may be phrased in various different ways, but fundamentally those great principles keep showing up. And I got a chapter on, I think 12 religions we cover, but then we've got a chapter called Smorgasbord, which is about ancient and alternative and native religions and pathways that are crucially important too. And that's fascinating. This book could keep going. And so just like this discussion, because this is an endlessly fascinating thing. And it's not just the head thing. It's about how we transform our lives. How do we live more successfully and joyously? And I hope that our listeners, our watchers, are feeling this sense of joy and exuberance that comes from discussing this. I feel it, and it's wonderful. That's why I'm excited to write this book, but also to have discussions like this. And if it engenders more discussion, that's wonderful.
Well,
That's
there was lively discussion about Buddhism for a while, and most of them seem to have no problem saying they are God. So you'll know.
Okay, good.
One person asked, how has the study of world religions impacted your personal spiritual practices?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I owe everything to it, I think, personally, because I've always had a keen interest in spirituality as a nature mystic when I was younger, and then I picked up the Tao in my late teenage years, and when I went to India, that really deepened it. And since then, I've been it's been osmosis. I've been absorbing all various practices, but again, it's not just about intellectual knowledge. You can write huge tomes about this stuff, and that's great. And there are many books out there. But I want it to be something that's meaningful for me in my heart and in my life. So I think that comes through in the book. I hope it's not just a study. It's experiential. I don't know what the other two have to say on that. Go ahead.
Well, I would say me too. When I started on my path, it was very yogic. People might say Hindu, but then the discovery of all the other world's traditions just enriched and deepened my own path, each in its own way, because you're seeing the one truth, the one divinity, but you're seeing it from different angles, like seeing the sun come through different windows with different shaded colors. So you get a stained glass mosaic instead of just one color. And that is enriching. And it's not just enriching in to the mind, but if you allow yourself to experience what people in other traditions experience, share their rituals, do the things they do, read their sacred works, it's a deepening as well as a broadening.
I agree very much with what you both said. I think I'm not a member of Unity, but I've certainly spent my life studying world religions. And for me, it's been like a great relief. Like I felt, the more I would discover, the more I felt, oh, beauty's everywhere. That's good. Like it would be such a sad thing if only one group had it. Like I don't think I'd be able to understand my humanity if wisdom or if beauty or goodness was reserved for one group. Like it would be devastating. It would be a loss. And I don't think I would be able to function. And so the idea that everywhere I look and every tradition, every corner of the world that I've had the privilege of traveling to, every meeting with a religious leader or community that I've done around the world, I found something that I can relate to and that I can learn from, and that tells me they know more than I realized. It makes it that living is okay, because I don't think I can live thinking it's not out there. I don't understand how you could, to be honest, in all truthfulness.
Okay, thank you. We got a couple of questions about evil. How do these religions deal with the existence of evil in the world, was one of them. And the other was, is there evil? Is Putin evil? Or just tragically a not fully formed person who's chosen himself over oneness? When I'm not acting in loving kindness, am I evil, or just letting my selfish ego run my life?
Right. Well, for me, evil is twisted good. There's only ultimately the good. And so what we call evil is sometimes very badly twisted good, twisted into such a bad shape that it looks completely evil. But of course, in Unity, we don't accept there's the devil as an entity in and of itself causing evil. It's just the human condition is problematic. And just as we have suffering, we have apparent evil. I don't think there's a power of evil. Now, when it comes to religions, each religion wrestles with this. What is the nature of good and evil? Judaism, obviously, and Christianity, but all other religions too. Look at this. But I think ultimately there's the understanding that something's awry. That something went wrong somewhere along the line. It wasn't that there's this inherent evil in the universe, but that it's definitely addressed, and it's a big subject. So we don't have time to talk about it. But Vanessa, what's your viewpoint on that?
We don't have time to talk about it, Paul.
I would say one thing. I wonder if the category of evil and good are not helpful. I wonder if they're just too heavy. They're too absolute. And I think they put us all in a knot in a way that I don't know if we can do very much with them. I don't know that I've ever met anyone that is absolute good. I might have hoped that I've met someone who is absolute good, but I don't know that I ever have. And I think that would be a lot to put on them. And I don't know that I know that I've never experienced absolute evil. Maybe if I had been born in different circumstances, I might say differently. But standing from the position that I stand from, or sitting right now, I think it's a little bit like what I was saying before. I don't know if I have the tools to comprehend something so extreme. And I think sometimes they weigh us down. And maybe if we let go of those really heavy words, we can work with the messiness of the in-between, instead of putting these really, really sharp divisions that are too far from almost every human experience.
Mm.
It exists, but I don't know what to do with it.
I think that's an excellent point, and it's a little bit about labeling, isn't it? We begin to label things as one thing or the other, and is that necessary? I don't particularly want to label Putin as the incarnation of evil, but on the other hand, he's doing some behaviors that are, extremely unsettling. But I pray for his soul, because the desire to destroy is got to be problematic for anybody, and if he thinks that's unacceptable, then there's concerns there. But I don't think it's helpful. I agree with you that just to label somebody one thing or the other, that life is too complicated. And ultimately, we have those same tendencies within us too. Hopefully we don't act out on them,
Right.
but we all have anger, and we all have, certain lower tendencies that sometimes can be expressed in less than satisfactory ways. Somebody put up "love our enemies." That's not always easy to do, isn't it? Especially when they're wreaking havoc around the world. But it's more about us. Where do we want to be? I don't want to be filled with hate for somebody, so I can't be loving. I want to be loving. So
there's a cartoon in the New Yorker of a couple leaving church, obviously after a service, and the husband says to the wife, "How can I love my enemies when I don't even like my friends?"
there we go.
I find it impossible to rise to the occasion and address the question, why is there evil, or what is evil? It's beyond my comprehension, and maybe beyond human comprehension. We can only theorize. I prefer to think things go awry in the world because our consciousness is not attuned to all that is good and all that is divine. And there are pockets of that. And there's going to be eruptions of bad behavior, whether it's some, crazy person who, in the street, or it's somebody who runs an empire and is doing, harmful things on a worldwide level. There's disharmony. Things, the human consciousness is out of whack. Human behavior is not harmonious with what is intended in the sort of divine plan of things. And then things go awry. But then there's the corollary, which is those of us who recognize that are called upon to do something. And that gets back to your fifth principle, doesn't it, Paul?
Yes.
Of action. I mean,
Yes.
we can be spiritual, but we don't want to, and we could, try to be above it all, but we can't ignore it. We can't bypass it.
Right. And I don't want to waste my precious energy, that I'd be given by the divine to fill my life up with hate or, labeling people one way or another. I need to keep myself as centered as I can in love and possibility, so that I can send that forth, like Vanessa said earlier, beholding the Christ in that person, and in myself, so that we can. And see, for me, that's the wonderful thing about the response of the Ukrainians right now, the resolute nature and the courage that they're exhibiting, some of the higher qualities. They're very innovative. They're selfless in their service to their fellow citizens, and it's just remarkable to see that. So even in these most adverse circumstances, it seems to me that, people are good inherently, and good will prevail. Love prevails. It reminds me of the Second World War. Everybody came together to overthrow the tyrannies that were happening at that time. And we may be in one of those circumstances again. This is a huge thing. This is one of the big things of our generation, right? Like 9/11, like Vietnam. This is huge. So how do we choose to be to respond from the highest and best? It's important.
So let's let's move into the Buddhism questions. And they
Okay.
may be along the same lines. There were a couple, when you all were talking about suffering and sadness and how Buddhism can sometimes feel heavy,
Right.
there were a couple questions. Is the sadness brought on by man himself? And can you speak to this idea that suffering is a choice? Pain is real, but suffering is how we perceive it?
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. Pain is inevitable. You know, somebody stabs you in the leg, that's going to hurt no matter which way you go about it. Suffering is mental, it's of the mind. And there's a lot of discussion in Buddhism about how we've come to a point that we suffer so much, and what are we seeing in the world that makes us suffer. And one of the most fundamental arguments is that everything is impermanent and we don't want it to be. And so we suffer. If we go back to Ukraine, as awful as this is going to sound, the suffering is on some level, we thought the country's going to, like tomorrow will be the same as yesterday. And I can wake up tomorrow morning and make my coffee and, you know, fulfill my dreams and my aspirations, and all of a sudden bombs are falling. And on a very, very basic level, what was is no longer is. And there's nothing we can do about that. Everything changes and we don't want things to change. And so we get very upset about change. But then bad things change too, and they turn to good, or the bad, you know, difficulties also are impermanent. But we suffer because things are impermanent, and we don't like it. And
Right.
the most profound suffering is our own personal impermanence, the fact that we will eventually disappear and die, and that everyone we love will die. And there's nothing we can do about that either. And that is a very profound, so when they talk about suffering, it's not just, okay, I'll choose not to. Sure. But these are very profound existential sufferings that this would be a perennial thing that we profoundly suffer as human beings with our own mortality. And I think every religion would agree with that. And it's kind of hard to disagree with it. And to come to terms with that is really difficult. But
Yes.
if we can find a way to come to terms with the fact that this isn't personal and that this is just the way of the world, then we release ourselves of that suffering. So in that sense, it's a choice, but it's not so much a choice. It's something you have to move towards. You have to gain understanding of. You have to let go of certain things. Choice sounds very active, and it sounds like you just accomplish it. I think I would go back to what Paul was saying of the gradual path. It's something that you gradually come to terms with and let go of your suffering. And it's not something that we can always do. Some sufferings are just very profound. And in that sense, not all of us are going to be able to let go.
You know, the Buddha talked about the two arrows, right? The first arrow was, you know, hits you, like you said, and it hurts, you know. The second arrow is where you internalize that hurt and begin to make a story about it, and the suffering arises from that. Remember my old professor at Unity, when I was in seminary, used to say this: there's suffering, and then there's useless, unnecessary suffering. And the useless, unnecessary suffering is the story we tell about the problematic nature of our lives. Again, I was watching something on the television, frontline Ukrainian soldiers, and they said for the first 3 days after the invasion, we were in total shock. We couldn't make any sense of it whatsoever. But then we realized our life had changed completely. We no longer had the country we had. And then everything seemed okay after that. Well, not okay, but everything was doable after that, because they said, now we're in a different reality. We're fighting an enemy now. We want to liberate our country. And so it's letting go of that idea of, oh, you know, my life used to be so sweet and kind, nice and loving, and now it's horrible. But they had that for a few days, you know, they had that shock, but then they decided there's a higher purpose here. And that, I think it's that higher purpose that trumps suffering, right? That even in the midst of devastation, there's that willingness, there's that desire to, I'm going forward. And that's where victory lies, I think. To me, that's the Buddha's victory. And it's the victory of all the great way showers that have pursued the path to the end, you know, and realized that awakening that we're talking about.
Yeah, I often think that people who equate Buddhism with suffering they haven't read past the first noble truth.
Right.
And
Right.
the first noble truth is that discontent, unhappiness, suffering is inevitable because, as Vanessa said, everything changes, everything is transient. But then there's a second, third, and fourth noble truths,
Right.
Right.
which culminates in there's a way out of that,
That's right.
and that's where the joy that Vanessa was talking about earlier enters into the picture.
And it's not a neutrality. What so many people imagine is that you have to become neutral and not get attached and not, right? It's a joy, like the freedom of that kind of mental anguish is understood to be pleasure. Compassion is supposed to be pleasurable. It's not a suffering it's not a neutrality. It's not, I'll eliminate all emotions and then I'll be okay. It's not suffering on one end and freedom from suffering is neutrality. It's joy, truly.
Right.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
in the Zen ox herder drawings that depict visually the path to enlightenment, enlightenment is a non-figurative circle, but it's a not fully enclosed circle. And then the ox herder comes down from the mountain and comes back into the world to engage in, and that's where action comes in from that awakened place. That's what we're all called upon to do.
And I think in the same way, we don't emphasize the crucifixion in unity because, that was a stage. It was suffering, incredible suffering, but, that lasted for a day or so. But, the resurrection, it points to an eternality. And so we emphasize that. So again, where is our emphasis? But then you can't avoid the cross either. We're all going through our cross experience in life, but we're not limited to it.
Okay, this is what I knew would happen. We wouldn't walk walking. But we're going to have to. Thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. For those of you listening, you will get a follow-up email, I think tonight, with more information about our guests, a survey about your experience. Then the recording of this will be available in about a week, and we'll send you another email with a link to that. Please feel free to share it with anyone who wasn't here, anyone who you think would enjoy this. Meanwhile, be reading. Paul's book is sold out on Amazon at the moment. They will eventually get more, but it is available on Kindle and it's available at unity.org/worldreligions. There it is. And notice that it has a free study guide. If you scroll down to the bottom of the book description, you can download the study guide as a PDF. Unity Books Presents will be back on May 24th with a new book called The Zen Executive. It's about the overlap of business practices and spiritual principles, written by Unity CEO Jim Blake. So thanks for joining us this evening. We hope to see you again on Unity Books Presents.
Thank you so much.